January 1st, 1917. The sun beats down on Tournament Park in Pasadena, California, where 27,000 spectators are about to see the established order of college football turned upside down by a band of underdogs from the Pacific Northwest. On one side of the field stands the University of Pennsylvania team, the very picture of Eastern football aristocracy. Their quarterback, Burt Bell, is the son of Pennsylvania's Attorney General. He'll later become an NFL owner and later the NFL commissioner. The Penn Quakers arrive with 4 All-Americans and the absolute certainty that Western football is, at best, a crude imitation of the real thing played back east. Facing the Penn Quakers is the Oregon Webfoots, a ragtag group of overgrown high school boys from Oregon. They won't be known as the Ducks for another decade, and they're led by a 25-year-old quarterback and coached by a Czech immigrant. Pacific Coast football is an afterthought on the stage of college football. It's so much of an afterthought, it's not even considered West by the football powers in the East. As an example of how Pacific Coast football was perceived, an article in the Altoona Times of Altoona, Pennsylvania from December 4th, 1916 urges Walter Camp, who picked the All-American teams at the time, to consider stars from the East and West. The Western Star reference is Ohio State's Chick Harley. Eastern football media considered teams from Ohio, Michigan, and Minnesota as the West in those days and didn't even consider the Pacific Coast. Remember, the year is 1917. The Rose Bowl game doesn't officially exist yet. In 1917, it was called the East-West Tournament game and wouldn't be called the Rose Bowl until 1922 when the stadium was opened and the first Rose Bowl game was played on New Year's Day with USC beating Penn State 14-3. But the game in 1917 is still recovering from its own disastrous birth. The inaugural 1902 game had been so lopsided, with Michigan crushing Stanford 49-0, that organizers abandoned football entirely for 13 years. Pasadena wanted people from across the country to come for their Tournament of Roses, so they needed attractive events at which people could spend their hard-earned money. They had replaced football with chariot races and ostrich runs. Only in 1916 did they cautiously return to football, and in just the third edition of the game, the tournament would witness something remarkable. In 1917, the Rose Bowl is the only postseason college football game. Because of that, all of the eyes of the college football world are upon this game. The Oregon Webfoots arrived in Pasadena with a solid 6-0-1 record, having surrendered just 14 points all season. But here's the kicker. They weren't even the best team in their own conference. Washington had the same number of wins, and they had tied in their head-to-head meeting. Oregon got the nod partly because the train fare from Eugene to Pasadena was $250 less expensive than from Seattle. Their opponent, the University of Pennsylvania, arrived with all the trappings of Eastern football royalty. The Quakers brought a 7-2-1 record and the prestige of Ivy League football at a time when the Northeast was considered the undisputed center of the football universe. But Oregon had 2 secret weapons that would prove decisive. First was Hugo Bezdek, their innovative Czech-born coach. Bezdek came to the United States when he was just 6 years old, then ended up playing football at Oregon before he became its coach. He would be inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 1954. Then there was Charles Shy Huntington, their 25-year-old quarterback, who exemplified the complete football player of the era, throwing, running, kicking, and playing defense with equal skill. Penn's confidence was so complete that their coach, Bob Folwell, even demonstrated their innovative reverse pass play to Bezdek during practice. As the Los Angeles Times would later report, Penn's quarterback Burt Bell would ruefully observe, Imagine what we thought and said when Oregon scored its first touchdown on our own play. The game's opening moments seemed to confirm Eastern superiority when Penn's Howard Perry launched a thunderous 50-yard punt that left Western fans in awe. Such kicks were practically unheard of in Pacific Coast football at the time, but if Penn thought they could intimidate the Webfoots with displays of Eastern superiority, they were in for a surprise. The first real drama came midway through the second quarter. Penn had recovered their own blocked kick and powered their way to Oregon's 3-yard line using a series of smashing runs up the middle. The Quakers seemed unstoppable until Penn's Quigley tried to attack the outside with 2 blockers leading the way. Oregon's left end, Brooks Mitchell, knifed through the interference and threw Quigley for a crushing 10-yard loss. Forced to attempt a drop kick from the 29-yard line, Quigley's efforts failed as the Oregon line charged through. This single sequence transformed both teams. Oregon's stage fright vanished, while Penn's swagger noticeably diminished. The third quarter brought the Shy Huntington show. Playing both ways, as was common in that era, Huntington intercepted a Penn pass to set up a 70-yard scoring drive. The Webfoots moved methodically downfield with a mix of passes from Huntington to Wright and Taggart, punctuated by powerful runs from both Huntington brothers. The drive culminated in perhaps the game's most delicious moment of irony. Oregon scored using Penn's own reverse pass play, with Huntington finding Lloyd Taggart in the corner of the end zone. In the fourth quarter, Huntington snagged another interception, setting up what might be the game's most spectacular play. Johnny Parsons broke free for a 42-yard run, stopped only when Penn's quarterback Burt Bell made a desperate tackle at the 1-yard line. Shy Huntington promptly scored himself, added another extra point, and the score stood at 14-0. Penn mounted one final drive, pushing 79 yards downfield in a desperate attempt to avoid the shutout. But it was Huntington, who else, who sealed their fate with his third interception of the day. A fourth interception was called back on a penalty, or his defensive statistics would have been even more remarkable. The reactions were priceless. Harry A. Williams wrote in the Los Angeles Times on January 2nd, 1917, Walter Camp and other alleged wise guys may be unable to hear our football players crying aloud in the wilderness for recognition, but nobody is going to worry about it. Thanking Walt for the honorable mention given some of our Western athletes, we beg leave to remind him that on the same gridiron that Washington State walloped Brown last year, the University of Oregon yesterday beat Pennsylvania by an identical score, 14-0. Beating the Easterners by that score is getting to be a habit, and it is beginning to pall on us. We hope they will send us something real tough next year. In the Spokesman Review of Spokane, Washington on January 4th, 1917, a column called The Old Timer Talks had this to say. The defeat of the select Pennsylvania 11 at the hands of old Oregon was as bitter a pill for the Easterners to swallow as quinine to a healthy person. They couldn't account for it. Moreover, they were shocked, beastly shocked. It was a phenomenon more startling than Halley's Comet. They blamed it on the weather, the water, the surroundings, the officials, the long ride over the rails, the grub, but never did they give it a thought that the basis of their defeat was being pitted against a better team. That's my old-timer voice. That's how I talk to my children sometimes. Let's move on. The excuses came from the East. In the Oregonian, on January 8, 1917, Penn's fullback J. Howard Berry stated, "No football team from the East can travel to the other side of the continent after its regular schedule and do itself justice in a postseason game." Now, he does say that We all admit that Oregon was the better team on the tournament field New Year's afternoon, and our friends, the enemy, are entitled to all the credit in the world. But he complains we weren't the football players who whipped Cornell. To be frank, our condition was bad. No team can survive a hard season at football, relax several weeks, and then cross the continent and come back strong. Now, you know that if something like that were posted to social media today or was in a press conference today, that Barry would be ripped to shreds for excuse making, even though he complimented Oregon. On the other hand, perhaps he had a point. I mean, they did have to travel all the way across the country by train. And that seems like a long time to be on a train to play football. What followed for Oregon football after this was decades of near misses and disappointments. 3 years later, Huntington returned to the Rose Bowl, this time as Oregon's head coach. That 1920 game against Harvard ended in a heartbreaking 7-6 loss, beginning what would become a familiar pattern. Now, Oregon's next Rose Bowl appearance wouldn't come until 1958, a loss to Ohio State, and then 1995, a loss to Penn State. In 2010, another loss to Ohio State. And then they finally broke through, and the drought finally ended in 2012 when Oregon defeated Wisconsin 45-38. 95 years after their first triumph. By then, the program had transferred from upstart underdog to national power, but that 1917 victory still stands as a watershed moment in college football history. The 1917 Rose Bowl was the moment when Western football announced its arrival on the national stage. True Western football, not just referring to Ohio or Minnesota as the West for the people in the East. Though Oregon would have to wait nearly a century to recapture the Rose Bowl magic, they had already proven what was possible, forever changing the geography of college football power. And that's the story of how Oregon changed the trajectory of college football history by winning the 1917 Rose Bowl. Now, I'm recording this a couple days after Oregon has been demolished by Ohio State in the first 12-team college football playoff. I don't think there's any doubt that Oregon is a national power now, and they have yet to win a national championship. But you have to think that that's due sometime in the next few years. And good for them. 95 years is a long time to wait for a Rose Bowl victory. This is John Johnston with Hardcore College Football History. If you liked this video, please boop the like button and subscribe to this channel. And tell your friends. And if you liked it a whole lot, please consider supporting me further on Patreon so I can make even better videos in the future. Thank you.